So, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Let's Talk Europe episodes. We have a special guest today from the States. Lots of definitions I came across how to introduce this guest. But let's do the MSNBC, title, information warfare expert, Molly McKew. So, hello, Molly.
Hi, good to see you.
So, well, it's a pleasure to see you. I mean, we had a chance to do it live, but online is sometimes better.
Sorry, I know I'm the worst. I'm so hard to get a hold of. I'm really sorry.
You are the best. So Molly, when I'm introducing you, maybe I'm skipping something. Maybe you would like to be introduced somehow differently.
No, it's really hard to give a succinct introduction. I think the relevant points for your audience are probably I worked with the Georgian government back in the day when it was the Saakashvili government. I've worked in Georgia, Moldova, done some projects in Ukraine, and worked in the Baltic states on a couple of things. So mostly I work on Russia, but in the region around Russia. And I teach at Georgetown University and write and do a couple other things. But I don't have one easy, simple title. So I try to fight Russians is kind of the bottom line.
All right. So as you see, not a very typical American we're gonna have today, but we're gonna talk about Russia, and definitely, I looked at the calendar. It's 296 days of war in Ukraine, and since you are an expert on warfare, I mean informational warfare, what has changed in those 296 days in terms of perception of narratives, of propaganda narratives that were pumped from Russia to the media, to the social media? What do you observe in terms of this almost a year time?
So I think if we're talking about Western audiences and ourselves, there's kind of a couple of big points. One is finally, after all of this time, especially in the period since like 2007, when Russia has been more active, especially in the information domain, I think finally we've pricked the bubble of some of the Russian narratives a bit more effectively. People are less willing to believe it's not their fault. Like, it's actually these terrible Ukrainians or whatever crap they're trying to sell us that day. Like, oh, we didn't shoot down the plane. It fell from the sky magically, whatever it is. I think that the real attempts to control narrative across a variety of different information media has been dismantled a bit through a whole variety of different means. But I think that's sort of the second point is very specific to Western audiences. So I think since the war in Ukraine has started, you've seen a lot. Well, the full scale invasion of Ukraine has started. You've seen a lot of commentary that we're winning the information war against Russia, and I think we need to be very clear that the information war we're winning is basically against ourselves, right? And the narratives have been very successfully built primarily by the Ukrainians and people who are supporting Ukrainians. The Baltic states are playing a big role in this as well, to muster support in the alliance. So there's no choice but to support Ukraine. And I think that first 5 days after the invasion, where Ukraine really showed everyone, no, we're not going to lie down and let Russian tanks roll over us. Sorry, everybody, you better send us weapons, was sort of the key phase in this. But I think what has been so incredible about 2022 is really seeing that it is public support of populations in Europe, especially in the Baltic states and in Poland, in Scandinavian countries, in the United States, a bit in the UK. But it's been public support that has really forced all of our governments, other than the Baltic states who would have done the right thing anyway, has really forced the West to respond in the right way to finally support Ukraine in its fight against the Russian invasion. So I think, again, it's this very specific information context of admitting the information war we're winning is against ourselves, that we finally have motivated ourselves to do the right thing. Because I think that outside of that bubble, if you go and look at how the war is being discussed and portrayed in African countries, in the Middle East, in Latin America, in parts of Southeast Asia, where the Russian information campaigns are very strong, where that's coupled very closely to diplomacy, where Wagner is active and working in a lot of places. The acceptance of the Russian narrative is still very high. And you saw that this year, for example, at the UN, where you saw a lot of African countries saying things like, enough with this war in Ukraine crap, like, can't we talk about real problems in the world, things that are affecting us? And I think the Russians have done a very good job of either strong arming or blackmailing people into believing, it's Ukraine's fault that the grain supplies have been disrupted. It's Ukraine's fault that blah, blah, blah. So I think that whole information domain needs a lot of work from all of us, and in a very aggressive, integrated economic, diplomatic, military information, humanitarian outreach, all the things. We really need to bolster our diplomatic outreach package to all of these places, because we're clearly not doing well there. And I think the final point I would make, and sorry for the long answer, is just that, especially in the United States, and I think I've seen examples of it in some countries in Europe, but obviously, I don't speak Lithuanian, so I can't see what's happening in your sort of native information environment. But I think that while the Russian sort of big information machine has failed a lot in what it hoped to be able to do right now, it's moving back to relying specifically on these kind of domestic supporters of Russian narratives that have been cultivated over time, academics, quote unquote journalists, some of these Russians who have left Russia, who are portraying themselves as independent media people in other countries. All of those sort of more nativized sources of Russian narrative have become more active and are working sort of from bottom up to reintegrate Russian narratives into our information environment. So those are the things that I see happening overall. But I think it's been a really interesting period where Russia has, like, a lot of their normal tools and tactics have not worked the way that they expected. And they haven't really been very quick at rebooting those efforts, which is good.
So I guess the main question here is, since you're from the States, and probably the point of view there on the other side of the Atlantic is a bit different. What narratives could you single out that were the most destructive in terms of reaching the Americans and kind of making them believe this propaganda? I guess one of those could be that Putin was always a traditional value guy and stuff like that, who is always defending some kind of abnormalities. But maybe you see it differently.
Yeah, no, I think there's maybe two primary veins that I would talk about in the US, especially in sort of the last 10 months. One that's much longer term that has been very apparent since 2015 and onward in the United States is this traditional values crap. And there is, as a very narrow slice of conservative Americans have gone sort of far right wing loony, and I won't color it any other way because it really is sort of detached from reality. You hear them echoing almost word for word the types of narratives that Russians had, that Russian propaganda has tried to instill in the US information environment for a long time. So, the hardcore anti-LGBT messaging in Europe, it's sort of, Europe is the gays. You don't want the gays, do you? If you're talking to Georgians or Ukrainians or whatever. Here, it's this traditional values message. And you've seen this very strongly in it sort of escalating in the US in the last year in ways that it really never has before. Really pushing on the same types of messages, this idea of gay propaganda, that in Russia there's these laws preventing people from talking to children about homosexuality, this idea that it's like recruiting people to be gay or whatever. And there's people in the United States that are starting to say the same types of crazy things. And lately, there's been a series of, in this very radicalized sect of the US, there's been this strange narrative sort of spinning around about drag queens, and how drag shows are like a very specific source of like gay propaganda that needs to be stopped. And you've seen a variety of, I think now there's 3 or 4 violent attacks on drag shows, which are like the least, I mean, previously like the least controversial, like sort of happiest weird thing in the United States, including in North Carolina, where there seems to have been domestic terror related incidents where some group blew up 2 power substations, knocking out the power for 40,000 Americans for like a week, to take out the power for this theater that was having a drag show, as like a statement against these immoral values or whatever. And that's just crazy, right? Like the fact that we've gotten to the point where people are conducting sabotage operations on American infrastructure for this crazy stuff. But I think that sub lane, and you guys know it well, you probably know it better than most Americans, but the exploitation of the idea of traditional values in the United States, this tends to be termed as family values, right? So anti-gay, pro-family, anti-abortion, all the different things that sort of fit in that category. This whole narrative environment has been really exploited in the United States, for radicalizing purposes. And it's like now a merger of kind of the far right US narratives and the Russian narratives, which are really, really disturbing if you've been paying attention to this stuff over time. So I think that thing is sort of really, that whole lane, there's a lot happening. It's very creepy. The other thing that I think has gained traction in recent months in the United States, I think Putin and the dudes around him realized how much their narrative wasn't working here, which is really when you saw them pull this nuclear threat card, right? Because it exploits this very specific fear in all of our societies, but especially in American society that still has these Cold War memories of nuclear doomsday. And I think you'll see Russia continuing to use this, where anytime they understand they're not winning the argument about Ukraine, that no one is going to support Ukrainian negotiations or ending the war before Ukraine is ready. Excuse me. I think you'll see them pull out this nuclear card and wave it around because people are so afraid of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, since you mentioned the loonies, in the political scene in the States, I cannot ask you about the other political aisle, because you have people like, Bernie Sanders and the AOC and others.
Yep.
How are they reflecting, this war in Ukraine? Is it affected their narratives, or that's not sticking to them?
I think they have tried to feel that they have a reasonable thing to say about the war in Ukraine, which is essentially the very standard, war is bad, there should be no war, like why should we support war? And it's like, forget that there's right or wrong, like war bad. And it's so clunky and outdated and sort of amateurish. It hasn't gained a lot of traction. There's a very specific part of the far left, which is the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party and society, which kind of wraps back around ideologically to the far right, and in between is kind of extreme libertarianism, which is isolationist, regardless of how you define it. On the right, the isolationism is, we have no duty to do any of this crap in the world. Like, let somebody else do it. We're going to focus on us. On the left, it's, we have no right to do these things in the world. America is bad. It's just another force for bad. Look at all the bad wars we've supported. Like, we should be at home making clean water for people in Detroit and stop spending money on all this foreign crap. But regardless of how you phrase it, it is a push from the extreme wings of both sides of both parties, both major parties right now in the United States, toward isolationism, which is always really dangerous in our history. I think you've seen it gain traction in how both major parties, on the Republican side, the small part that remains that is sort of normal; on the Democratic side, the very large part that remains that is fairly normal. You've seen it gain traction in how the parties discuss American foreign policy and what America is doing in the world and what our role should be in the world. And the Biden administration, likes to get up and give speeches about supporting democracy and rah, rah, rah. But it's a very back-footed policy where the withdrawal from Afghanistan was what it was, and there's no way to make it look any better than it was, and the outcome is certainly as bad as everyone predicted. Um, there's been other places where we've really abandoned allies and sort of left them to their fate. I think on Ukraine, they try to sell this as a great success story for them, for themselves and the administration. And like, it's real nice that they've innovated how to spend American money faster on weapons, which is essentially the main thing that's happened. Um, and it's good, obviously. Like, I'm not downplaying how important it is to send ammunition and supplies and equipment quickly to Ukraine. But there still has been these attempts to sort of hold back Ukrainian initiative. No, we're not going to give you this weapon. No, we're not going to give you ATACMS. No, we're not going to give you that thing, for this fear that Ukraine is going to invade Russia, which is just like what are you even talking about right now? So just this very, in some ways, subtle post-Iraq war brand of isolationism, which is really this malaise about what America's role is in the world. Like, maybe we don't really have anything better to say than anyone else, has for a long time been taking root in our politics in America. And I think what was so interesting for me in this post-February context was the same here as in Europe, which was our government had no choice but to respond because public support for Ukraine is very high. And it may not be the same here as it is in Lithuania or Estonia, because there's not the same sort of, similarities of history, sort of ties of history. It doesn't look the same to us as it does to you. But we know right and wrong, and we know Ukraine good, Russia bad. Like, that's easy enough for Americans to understand, and there has been very high public support, and that's important. So I think it's been interesting for me in this after February context to see that the right instincts in the American public are still there. It's just we totally lack leadership trying to sell this stuff to us. No one is talking to us in the political domain about America's role in the world, about what that looks like, about how we're reshaping that in the modern context, about how everything is going to be different after this Ukraine war, right? Like, everything is going to change if we do this right. Ukraine is giving us the opportunity to do everything differently in the future. And so far, no one in the United States, and I think more broadly in the West, we need to hear more leadership voices putting context to this for us. And right now, we're just not seeing it.
But what do you think? There is this narrative that the West is so mature that it doesn't need the Churchill-type leaders anymore. There's a collective West. All those bureaucrats can do the stuff even better than some vocal leaders. How do you see this?
I mean, is it true that the machinery of all of our things kind of clunked forward in this context and it worked out? Yes. Obviously, stuff is getting to Ukraine and they can continue to fight the war. But I think leadership matters in so many different ways, right? It matters for us. It matters for context. It matters for how you are mustering national will and support. And I think particularly for me, this after February timeframe has been so disappointing when looking at the American administration, because the first year of the new Biden administration was really dealing with the context of democratic erosion in America and showing that responsible governance from the top level, the national level, matters, dealing with economic issues, dealing with social issues, dealing with other things. Sort of unraveling this idea that all government is bad that the Trump administration was focused on so succinctly. But they're really focused on this very domestic context that was viewed by many of their supporters as a conservative war on democracy in America. And so it's so disappointing, and then in the second year to see the international sort of global context to this, which is everywhere there is a perceived erosion of or attack on democratic values and ideas and like our history and what we see as important and what we think we stand for in the world. Why not link those things, right? Because it actually matters. Historically, it matters in America that what we look like in the world is sort of how we see ourselves at home a lot of the time. And like the administration missing the opportunity to sort of link those things and say what we are doing for Ukraine matters because of what we also need to do at home. And they've just sort of like put Ukraine in this strange box. They hardly ever talk about it. They don't really try to sell it domestically as an important thing. To me, that's disappointing, but you know.
So, since you mentioned, the erosion of democracy, I have to ask this: how do in the United States, I mean, the society perceives that democracy is being defended in Ukraine? Does that ring any bells, or after I don't know, maybe Hunter Biden stories and other stories in Ukraine, Trump stories in Ukraine, democracy in Ukraine might sound a bit complicated to the Americans?
I think the good news is because Americans pay very little attention to global affairs writ large. I think the most simple story right now, which is Russia bad, Ukraine good, Ukraine fighting for democratic stuff in its country, is the one that still cuts through most of what Americans kind of understand, right? That Ukrainians have been fighting without enough stuff, just basically for survival, and are doing amazing things. I think that story is a good news story that Americans really like, and we've been hearing it and absorbing it well. There is, on the conservative side, these longer line narratives that have been purposefully built in our information environment since 2016. One of the first things that happened after Trump was elected, like one of the first weird, very Russian sourced stories in our normal media environment. This was in the New York Times, I think, or maybe it was in Politico. I can't remember where that reporter was then, but was this very specific attempt to say that Ukraine and Estonia had been providing information to US intelligence about Donald Trump's ties with Russia, right? So like from the very beginning of the Trump administration, there were these strange Russian efforts to say Ukraine in particular is against Donald Trump and is working against conservative Americans and blah, 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 blah. And that's then manifested in 1,000 different ways, including all of this Hunter Biden nonsense, which was a messy story even before Trump was elected. It's just doesn't look good. Like the origins of the story that Hunter Biden was, on the board of this energy company in Ukraine while his father was vice president is just like, obviously that was never going to look good. There's no way to sell it as something that looks good. And it's very easy to then pull that into these long conspiracies that connect to everything in the universe. I think the narrative on Ukraine and then all the impeachment stuff and the blackmailing of Zelensky, everything else, the narrative on Ukraine on the conservative side in sort of the Fox News, Newsmax, InfoWars universe has become very messy. Which is not to say that conservative Americans don't also support Ukraine. It's just more messy. The thing that I think is really funny is like my conservative military friends who are very much inhabiting this Fox News world are also unhappy with what the Biden administration is doing in Ukraine. But what they want is like more war. They're like, we need to just send our guys over and fight with the Ukrainians and end this thing. Like, why are we even pretending that we're not involved? And so that's really interesting to me. But I think you're right that there has been, on the conservative side especially, there has been this effort to really twist perceptions on Ukraine. It's corrupt, you can't work there, it's hopeless, it's anti-American, whatever, to try to make it something that is not ideologically distinct from Russia. Like these are both sort of gray, messy things that you can't get involved in, right? Which it doesn't take very much effort to understand is not true, but a lot of effort has gone into this in the American information environment. You're absolutely right.
But here I have to ask, because since I follow quite a lot of conservative outlets in the States, of course, Tucker Carlson is number one, which stands out, and I would like to get your opinion on that.
Sure.
But there are also others, Matt Walsh and Karen Owens, who say that, look, they just, banned some political party in Ukraine that is anti-democratic, doesn't matter that it's a war there, and this party is pro-Russian, or they banned, a TV station. What has happened to those conservative outlets, and especially the Tucker Carlson, who is not sure what he is? Is he a useful idiot, or is something else? I mean, how do you see
He's
that?
not an idiot. That's the problem. Tucker knows exactly what he's doing. It's probably a financially connected story, but I think starting in 2015, in this horrible American election where Trump was elected, like the really messy information environment beforehand, you started seeing more very strange headlines in conservative media, some of which were seeping in through further right outlets and channels that were influencing regular conservative media, and some of which seemed to have been a purposeful merger of narratives in a variety of ways. And those have gotten worse in terms of seeing what I would call overt Russian propaganda narrative in conservative media. And what's been so interesting about this context after February in the United States is how quickly those talking points get into conservative, like, on, if you're watching the more left-leaning outlets or reading, liberal newspapers in the United States, there's not very much of the day-to-day of what's happening in Ukraine except for big military news, right? Like, this city was retaken, this thing happened, whatever. But if you're watching the more conservative outlets, you're right. There's like these micro stories like, and the Ukrainian parliament did this today, and it's a sign that they're terrible. And it's like, who actually spends the time writing these talking points? But clearly they're being put together, distributed across a range of outlets in the United States to create this perception of doubt in Ukraine and Ukrainian government and its
But Molly,
intentions.
like when you look at it, well, the conservative people should be, quite, well, they're usually a bit older than, the Democratic electorate, so they should, filter this stuff. And when you say some kind of financial,
Yeah.
thing is involved, is it possible? I mean, well, Tucker Carlson probably earns a decent, yearly salary in terms of how
Tucker
popular he.
Carlson makes a lot of money
Exactly.
from
So
Fox
how
News.
how can you really I don't know, bribe him from the Russian side?
I think part of it is about personal gain. I think part of it is about perceptions of their own power, right? And on the further right part, you've seen, for example, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, the sort of gun activists in the United States, CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, which it used to be like a U.S. conference, now it's a global brand, and it's been doing conferences in such fine places as Hungary for Bolsonaro, in Brazil before the election, in all of the places that sort of fit the same description of populist leadership. I think there has been this, sort of Steve Bannon world globalization, this idea that in whatever Trump was, there is a global brand of I don't even know what you call it, like anti-political organization that exists in terms of an illiberal view of leadership that is emerging in a lot of different places. And I think there's been a lot of efforts to build that into this more global effort. And that money is seeping into our environment. So like when you see Tucker Carlson go visit Orban and be at CPAC Hungary and do all these other things, like, what are you doing there? Like, what do you even, I don't understand, like, what you even think
He's
you're
visiting a
doing there.
conservative country.
Right. Well, right. And that's how they brand it, is like, oh, Orban is this wonderful conservative. Before the February context, there was also, I think he was in Poland too, before the Polish government kind of shifted away a bit from some of the directions it had been going. I think, but this effort to create the idea that this is a bigger initiative is important for the conservatives that support some of those more radical views, because it makes them feel better about some of the stuff that they're thinking. And Tucker's been like the national face of this that's still acceptable to people, right? Because you have people like, the InfoWars personalities. You have Steve Bannon himself, who does his own war room crap online. You have these other personalities who have been pushing further right narratives, but Tucker sort of takes it and cleans it up a little and makes it a little more acceptable to mainstream conservatism. until they're saying the stuff that they don't understand is actually crazy. And I mean, it's just whole families in America have been ripped apart by love of Tucker Carlson or not. Because it is just like he'll mainstream light Nazi views and white supremacy and all of these other things in a way that is profoundly disturbing. And certain people on the conservative side don't question it anymore. A lot of people just ignore it. And if you ask them, how can you watch this guy when what he's saying is this? They're like, oh, it's just, he's not serious. It's just a show, whatever. But some people don't ignore it and they take it much more seriously. So I think it's this, again, like Tucker Carlson doesn't work for Fox News, right? He works for Fox News Entertainment, which is it's not the news division, it's the primetime entertainment division, which gives them different rules of operation. And I think for a lot of people, there's this ability to kind of separate, oh, it's just the show. Like when Trump was doing these terrible things, a lot of his supporters would say, oh, he's just doing it for attention or whatever. He's not serious about any of the stuff. And this has become a reflex in conservative America on some of these more controversial things that are happening. And the lack of willingness to accept, you might think it's a show, but other Americans are conducting domestic terror attacks based on those ideas. Is a problem.
Yeah, but
really
somebody can say that all the other outlets are fueling Antifa and similar organizations. So it's quite interesting in the States what you have with those.
The whataboutism, the moral equivalency, is a powerful tool for all propaganda, right? And I think you have like a very narrow set of things where the idea of Antifa was actually even vaguely real, which was kind of in Portland, Oregon, right? Like just the Portland stuff. And that's the constant example that conservative media will refer to. But the rest of it was not existent. Like there is no Antifa. There is no like national Antifa uprising happening. Like that's just online. And it's this difference between sort of perceptions and reality that are very different in left-wing, right-wing extremism. I'm not dismissing the left-wing stuff, which is also stupid and destructive. But the right-wing stuff tends to manifest more in real-world situations and for law enforcement. And it's been a challenge in the United States because in a lot of our country, we have this very informal law enforcement system where you have elected sheriffs who are kind of in charge of local law enforcement divisions, and those tend to be, conservative, from conservative counties and states. And a lot of those sheriffs are fully entrenched in the InfoWars information universe and are like walking around drinking coffee out of QAnon mugs. And you're like, oh my God, how are these people in charge with enforcing the law in our country? So I think there is this imbalance in perceptions versus reality of the impact of these things. But I think it's part of the American right is starting to reckon with this, but it's going to take some time to unravel some of the views. And I think both sides of America, the entirety as a country, would really benefit from leaders explaining to them why we need to be in the world doing things, why our alliances matter, why we like Estonia and Lithuania, why we spend money in these places, why we think they're important. And right now, no one is doing that. And it's just laziness in our political environment and fear that talking about this stuff won't be popular. But like, that's what leadership is, right? Is like convincing people of ideas, not just reflecting opinion polls. So I would love to see more leadership, but right now it's very quiet.
Well, so finalizing this topic, I have to ask because when we tend to talk with Europeans about the political scene in the States, we kind of come to an agreement that let's say Republicans, they cannot agree with anything that Democrats do, and probably the opposite. Is that an actual problem, or there are some other I don't know, some kind of streams, underwater streams that these two political groups cannot agree on the topics and geopolitics, let's say?
I mean, what American politics in the last 40 years has become extremely polarized. The thing that used to be exempt from that, particularly in the sort of decade after 9/11, was foreign policy, which in general has not been other than very specific topics like Israel, some stuff on Taiwan, in general, U.S. foreign policy has not been a partisan issue. There tends to be sort of unified views on most of what's happening in Congress and the committees in State Department, whatever. And that's really not been the case in the last decade as this has gotten further and further apart. And yeah, I mean, while there's a very small group that still tries to work in a bipartisan way in the House, which is a little more polarized and crazy, and in the Senate, which is becoming more polarized and crazy, which is unfortunate because it used to be kind of the grown-ups and it's not so much anymore. There are still some people who are trying to work in a bipartisan way. And on specific foreign policy issues, and I would specifically mention Ukraine, there has been good unity between parties. On the Ukraine votes, there's been sort of in each vote, like a few more Republicans that are not voting to support the aid to Ukraine, but there's still a lot of Republicans voting on all these bills. And in the Senate, it's pretty strong. But on other issues, on like any other issue, the two parties just can't work together, even if it's something that's good for the American people, that's good for the American public. It doesn't matter if in reality X Biden, economic measure will provide $400 billion for your state to do things. If you're a Republican, you're going to go out and vote against it and say it's terrible, and then go back to your state and tell them, like, look, I got you all this money, aren't I wonderful? But the votes are really partisan. And I think, when I first came to DC, which granted was a long time ago now, but sometimes there was people would go on TV and debate and they would seem like they were opponents of things. But all those guys actually hung out at night and were friends. And there was like a camaraderie, especially in the Senate between senators and between staff. And in general, DC kind of talked to itself in different ways. And that's really not the case anymore. That partisanship has gotten much deeper, especially in the newer brands of progressives and far-right conservatives. They're not hiring professional staff, they're hiring extremists from their campaigns, right? So it's like super partisan ideologues who come to DC looking for fights. And who are looking more for social media clicks than for actually doing anything good for Americans. The environment has changed a lot, and I think undoing that is going to take some time. I think we're right at the brink of, does it get better or does it get worse in America? I think the next presidential election cycle will be really destructive in our domestic politics. We'll see what happens, but it's not something I'm looking forward to. I may just move to Lithuania and avoid the next election entirely.
No problem. We are always happy to house you in Lithuania if you need. But
just
yeah,
don't make me watch another American election on TV. I can't do it. It's awful.
Yeah, maybe let's leave the election because otherwise we're gonna do a 3-hour episode. But a few other things that one of them I have to ask you.
Sure.
Because the Lend-lease is actually quite a headache in terms of eastern part of Europe who think, why do Americans not kind of use this mechanism, which would be kind of reasonable in terms of making money. We all know that, let's say, United Kingdom just finished its payments to the States probably a few years ago. So of course we hear that Congress and Senate people, they say that look, this is a much more reasonable way to support Ukraine and not through Lend-lease. But why is Lend-lease stuck, in your opinion? Why we are not seeing this tool which could be very effective? Or it's the whole escalation thing here?
I think, well, I mean, that's part of it. I think it's from the Biden side, and many of the people in the Biden administration who are most important on Ukraine, Russia policy are products of the Obama years and that haven't fully removed themselves from the same types of thinking in ways that are sometimes very unhelpful. So I think when it comes to Lend-lease, when it comes to why can't we do X, why can't we do this fighter jet exchange, why can't we do all these things? it is the desire in many of those individuals to maintain control of the situation and not to give too much of that control directly to Ukraine, which is the wrong impulse, which has been proven wrong in everything Ukraine has done since February, which is maintain incredibly high moral standards in how they are fighting the war. Which is show that they're not going to go out and be butchers the same way the Russians are against Ukrainian civilians. They have shown that they are responsible in how they are using all the weapons and crap that has been given to them. And they have shown that time and time again, they are thinking differently than us. They are outthinking our strategic thinkers in the United States. And they are winning a war that we told them there's no fucking way they could fight. Excuse my language. And that alone, like, we should still be in shock from how wrong we were in February about Ukraine. But you still see these statements from Blinken, from Sullivan, from others, from guys at the Pentagon, when there's these questions from reporters, why aren't we giving Ukraine ATACMs? Why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we giving them tanks? Why aren't we giving them jets? Whatever. Why aren't we giving them armed drones? Like, why can't we do these things? The answer every time is essentially, we have determined that in this phase of the war, Ukraine does not need this capability. And
what does that mean in human terms?
Exactly. And it's like, and in so many ways, it's like the one eyebrow. What are you even talking about? Because in every phase of the war, we have not understood what it was that Ukraine was actually doing, right? So like when they took back Kharkiv, we didn't know they were going to do that, and we were pissed about it, right? Like there was like all this stuff in the media afterward leaked from different sources in the US that the Ukrainians aren't sharing their strategic plans with us, right? Because we leak them and it's bad security, right? Like, but so when we say we have determined Ukraine doesn't need this for their current phase of the war, it's a totally stupid response because we don't know what the Ukrainians are doing, and for the right reasons, right? Ukraine is extremely close hold in how they are planning the war. Because the security environment there is porous and they don't want their plans to leak. And that is very smart for them. So I think when we're saying we have determined Ukraine doesn't need this for this phase of the war, what we're saying is we have determined we don't want Ukraine to use this in the way that we think they're going to use it. And I think we all know that specifically, this is not actually about Ukraine invading Russia, which we all know is not going to happen. It's about Crimea, and it's about where what is our imagined version of the finishing point of the war. A couple of weeks ago, Tony Blinken was being interviewed and said something about Ukraine that was essentially, our goal and our strategy remains exactly the same as it's always been, which is to support Ukraine and strengthening its positions and negotiations, blah, blah, to retake all of the territory that has been lost since February 24th. And it's like, wait, since when has that been? And of course, a bunch of people rushed in after to say, no, there's been no change. This is not about Crimea, whatever. But that was a very specific statement. Like the way he said it, territory lost since February 24th. Tony Blinken doesn't make mistakes like that. And if this is actually what they are thinking, is like you kind of get to the point where it's the this year war losses. And then you kind of lean on the Ukrainians to negotiate. No, like that's not going to work for Ukrainians. And I think we, the United States, not you, the Baltics, who certainly understand this, need to understand that the biggest missed opportunity for us, the United States of America, would be in restraining the Ukrainians and how they finish this war to try to give the Russians some saved face or whatever. The Ukrainians have seen very clearly from the beginning of this the possibility of a different relationship with a different Russia if this war is won. And we still don't see that in a strategic sense. Like we'll say it, like our guys will go out and they'll say it on TV, oh, different, new, blah, blah. But they don't actually envision what that is. Like what does NATO look like after this? What does NATO look like with Ukraine in it? What does NATO look like if we still don't let Ukraine in? How does that create more divisions in the alliance? Because you've seen this, not division, but sort of distinction emerge in NATO during the war, where you have the Baltic states sending forward absolutely everything they have. The publics in these countries are raising hundreds of thousands of dollars in support for Ukrainians. Similar levels of support in Poland. The Czech Republic has been pretty as a public pretty forward leaning on this. The Scandinavian states have been pretty good on what they're doing. The UK has been one of the strongest supporters of Ukraine in the whole defense sector for some time. But you see this kind of, some people are calling it like a new intermarium, whatever it is. But you kind of see it's like the countries who are closest to Russia, who understand that we need to permanently change this dynamic with Moscow, and who are tired of being talked over by Washington talking to Moscow or Berlin talking to Moscow and Washington, but not including them when they're the ones who are actually at the front fighting this war right now. I think this has changed the dynamics within the alliance, and most of you are too polite to say it very directly. Although I think there was a recent trip where the Baltic and Nordic foreign ministers went together to Kyiv and kind of made some statements. I think this is preparation for the next NATO summit, which will be in Vilnius in the summer. But I think there is this sort of ideological block emerging within NATO that is like, we're the ones who showed up. We're the ones who sent weapons. We're the ones who have been supporting Ukraine. We're the ones who've been dragging the rest of you along. Enough of this. Like, it's time to actually change.
Somebody can say, look at the, the dollar sign, and the amount of money that has flown from US, and it's still, the highest donor and supporter. So, there are some in favor things that can always be said, when somebody is pushing that the US is not giving enough.
Yeah, and we're not. And yes, what we have done is significant, but we understand exactly what that level is and where it could be more. And there's things that we have done that have indicated how wrong our strategic mindset on this is. For example, we did not really order more munitions until like 2 or 3 months ago. We should have been doing that in March. And now there is this kind of, not a supply line disruption, but there are issues in how we are sourcing munitions, and everybody knows it. It's becoming a much more public discussion. But it's because we're still so back-footed in how we view Russia, and everything that the United States intelligence and strategic community is thinking still tends to be, you do what you can to kind of prove your point, but at some point you're going to have to stop fighting because no one can really defeat Russia. And that's not true. It's not true diplomatically. It's not true in a military context. And we're still not thinking of that the right way. And I think these allies that I was just talking about, including Ukraine, have been like literally like grabbing us by the ankles and like trying to pull our fingers away from this railing of status quo with Russia. We're not quite there yet. We're still clinging on. But I think this is the opportunity that we will miss if we get it wrong, is we'll try to put it back the way it was. Like, I think the greatest hope of the US intelligence community right now is like Putin kind of falls into a hole and a very similar guy to Putin takes the chair. And it's like a new Russia, and we can work with them, but it's exactly the same system with a different guy in charge, because it's the least scary alternative to us. But that may not be, like, we should not work toward limiting that as the possibility for Russia, right? Russia might fall apart, and we shouldn't stop that. And no one's even really talking about or thinking about it here, and that is a big mistake.
So a few final questions, not to kill you with our podcast.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
So since you mentioned that, that this narrative of a post-Russian world, I mean, in the world where Russia is not playing the part that it was been playing for a while, so, and the security architecture, how do you see this whole, do think tanks in the States have some idea how to live in the world without Russia as one of the main powers? Because we tend to hear that China and the United States have decided that they're gonna kick out Russia from this big boys club. But how is it in your perspective? Is it possible? Is it already like discussed how the world should look without Russia, and or they're very afraid of the nuclear stuff that might get to the Prigozhins and Kadyrovs and others?
Well, it's interesting because I think in addition to the nuclear threat narrative being manipulated in our media environments, the other thing in the US that has become there's at least attempts to make it a controlling narrative. Is this, the spiders in the jar in the Kremlin, like which faction is up, which faction is down, what does it really mean? But it's sort of like creating this fear of the what next, like, oh god, it could be so much worse. What if Kadyrov and Prigozhin end up in charge? Like, we tend to overthink these things as if we really have a choice in what the outcome is going to be. And I think what we need to see is the Russia that we believed we were talking to these last 30 years never really existed. And this is what the Ukrainians have really shown us, right? That we've lived inside this box of smoke and mirrors. Our actions, our policies, our dealings with Moscow have been so constrained by a belief in a Russian strength that was not real. That we have limited ourselves, and more importantly, we have failed the region around Russia. We have failed the countries that escaped the Soviet Union, including failing Russians themselves, by failing to see that the post-1991 context could have been so much different than it was, because we kept believing the bullshit Moscow was selling us. And the Ukrainians just sort of put a pin into that balloon and blew it up. And they were like, it was never there, guys. And I think, your intelligence services, the Estonians and the Lithuanians in particular, have been trying to explain this nicely to the United States for some times. And I think we're still not there yet. The Germans are definitely not there. The French are not there. The UK is like, some of the people are there and the other half is still with their dealings with Moscow. It's very strange. But I think we are at this pivot point where either we, the West, ends up being the ones propping up Moscow's false narratives with our bad policy and actions, or we decide to shape what comes next. And that is scary, and it requires boldness, and we haven't done either of those things very well in the past 20 years. But we really need to have it, because it is no longer just about some imagined geopolitical games. It is this crucial point in history, and more importantly, it is about all these people that we have failed. And the Baltic states are polite enough never to point out to us how badly we failed you for the 40 years we left you as prisoners to the Soviet Union. And the Ukrainians don't really bring it up very much either. But our wrong perceptions of Moscow and how we have dealt with Moscow for a long time have caused a lot of suffering. And we do have debts in that category that need to be corrected. And now is the time to do that, because all of you are helping us to do that work. I think we have to do this for Russians, for everyone who escaped the Soviet Union, for ourselves. We have a moral imperative to do this, and it's best for our security and our economies. And that's the thing that I think is so critical. And that framework then becomes why we can worry less about China, why we can worry less about this architecture that Russia and China have been trying to build together in the world. We need to do this now because there's nobody else who's like joining the club until we get our club right? And it'll be better with Ukraine in, better with victorious Ukraine in. We will be in the best possible place going into the rest of the century.
So since you mentioned, the future, all the other stuff that was mentioned about, the moral, stuff that is from 40 years. I mean, it's very unusual to hear from the American, but that's of course pleasant for me as a Lithuanian. Russian liberals. I want to end this, episode on Russian liberals, because there are probably different perspectives. How the West sees Russian liberals and how Ukraine, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Poland sees Russian liberals. We tend to see that they are the same imperialistic people who just want, Russia without Putin and, different crown, maybe different oligarchs, or maybe something else. But when you start talking about demilitarizing Russia or denuclearizing Russia, or even the worst, the scariest thing for them, the division of Russia into smaller countries, into ethnic countries, they tend to talk that this is, this is crazy, this is unfair, and how does that look from the other side of the pond?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's the right question, and for me, the question is always: is the Russia that you want to build any different for the West, or how the United States has to deal with you than the Russia that exists under Putin? Most people don't ask that in the United States. There's a very simple, the simple litmus test that a lot of these people, that the Russian opposition, that the independent media, that whoever these groups are, have gotten away with for a long time is, are you against Putin or are you not against Putin? And that, of course, is the space that Russian propaganda exploits really effectively. There's a lot of media outlets, individuals, whoever, who are anti-Putin, but it's always, yes, Putin is bad, but, and then there's like, but Crimea is ours, but whatever, whatever. And for me, in this whole space, since February especially, I think there's been, obviously, like, Gary Kasparov says the right things. Khodorkovsky, in limited contexts, has shown that he understands after February everything is very different.
It's
And at least
amazing how good you understand this part of the world.
No, I know, but I listen to them, and like I listen to them in Russian, I listen to them in English, I listen to what their people are doing, and you see there's like, at least like Gary is Gary. Khodorkovsky understands it has to be different and is trying to figure out what this looks like, understanding the domestic context in Russia, but also like understanding reality. And everybody else is still in this Putin is bad, but space. And I mean, again, because I spend a lot of time in the region, you see these attitudes. Like there are tons of Navalny people who are all in exile in Lithuania, in Estonia, etc. And what are they like there? Well, they call these places provinces, right? Like this is literally the attitude, is like, we have to be in this provincial place, like we want to be back in our cafes in Moscow. It's like, then go back. Like these countries have given you safe haven, they give you space to work, and you're complaining about being in the provinces. Like take your imperialist attitude and stick it. And I think the more you interact with it, the more you see that the ideas and values they are espousing are about themselves and not about real big ideas in a different Russia. And I have a hard time with that, because I also want to have easy, smart recommendations to make to people who say, how do we change Russia? Like, wouldn't it be easy if it was just, you got to support this Navalny guy? But it's not that simple. And I think everybody wants the clean solution. What's the next phase? And there's no answer to that. It has to be, Russia has to confront its history. Russia has to have serious structural reform in every sector, but like it really needs to fall apart in some aspects, and it never really had to do that because we propped it up in the 90s. And making it confront its history has to be a piece of this. And I think it's just so, it's part of what I teach in one of my courses, but you guys know your history, obviously, in the region. And I think after the 90s, there were so many efforts in every nation to kind of talk about Stalinist crimes and purges and, deportations and your history and how these affected the states that you have built coming out of that period of history. And Russia hasn't done this. And you've seen countless examples of this from the few people who have tried to talk about this history in Russia. And it really does change your perspective on what you are as a nation to confront your own crimes. It's one of the things that I think is so interesting about America. Like, no, we have not gotten everything right. Like, obviously, we have slavery in our history. We have, wars against Native American populations in our history. We have the Japanese internment in World War II in our history. But we talk about this stuff and we confront ourselves with it. And we think about what that means about us and how we test our own values. And we try to make it better. And it's that process of churning on your own hard past that is so important. And Russia just tries to look to the future, to the next horizon. Like, no, none of this mattered. The Soviet period, it wasn't us, it was these Soviets, whoever those were. It's something else. And like, Russians need to own it. And they need to understand what it says about them as people, as individuals, that they have not confronted this history. So for me, there's a lot that needs to happen there. And there's no easy support center in the Russian liberal community to embrace and support. And I think you've seen that whole very strong seeming center of exiled Russian liberal society that has been built over the past decade or so really collapsed a bit since February because they had such a hard time saying anything useful about Ukraine. Still can't in many respects. And that says a lot. That says a lot.
Okay, so the last question, since we took the liberals, I have to ask you about the Lukashenko and the Belarus.
Yeah.
Because before the February, he was perceived as the last dictator, which of course is a mistake. But now, this influential figure that we have hosted in Lithuania, I'm talking about Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya. She's trying to portray that the Belarusians are, victims, but the Maidan in Minsk and Maidan in Kiev is two completely different things. Before this last phase of the war in Ukraine, the Belarusians they wanted Putin to moderate, their internal problems and stuff. How do the West and especially the states perceive this country? Is it considered Russia, like in a broader sense, or something is different?
I think it's the answer is it's in terms of what's actually happening is it's kind of similar. It's kind of similar to the Russian liberals thing, right? Where the thing that's so interesting about the whole Tikhanovskaya universe of things is obviously there was a very real domestic uprising in Belarus from which these sort of figures emerged as leaders. And it's not to say the sentiment in Belarus was not very real and that there are not a lot of people who want a different Belarus, who are tired of this Lukashenko
but Molly,
stuff,
I
who
have
want a
to,
different way.
I have to emphasize that there were no NATO flags, no European,
But
like
I was getting to
intentions.
this. I was getting to this. I was getting to this. But they very specifically, like all of this stuff was happening in a domestic context, and both the groups and then very specifically the leaders who emerged from this group emphasized this is not a geopolitical discussion. Like this is not about Belarus being in the West or not being in the West. Like this is just about our domestic things. And that attitude continued up past February, right? Where there was this awkwardness in the Belarusian opposition that lives outside of the country in this leadership group that has sort of appointed itself or whatever, where they still don't really have anything good to say about what's happening in Ukraine, what they need to do. They had built themselves as a nonviolent protest movement, and they tried to sort of keep this patina after the war and didn't really know how to handle, oh, but now there's this war and people are expecting us to fight. So I think you have seen in Belarus, some acts of resistance, some acts of sabotage. I don't think those are connected to this political thing. I think that's a different landscape. And I think this, again, the questions that have emerged since February have made it very difficult for this Belarusian opposition group to find its place in the new landscape. They need a new message. It is a geopolitical war or context in which they now have to deal. They themselves have to have something better to say about Belarus and what they're offering for Belarus and its future than just it's not geopolitical. Like, what does that even mean when like Russia has moved its military into your country and like it's different now? You need to have something else to say. I don't think anybody in the US, barring a very small, sector of organizations that still do democracy promotion work, have had any time to think about this at all since the war started. There's still some support for that group and that movement because they're like, what else do you do, right? But there's a lot of questions about what we do with Belarus moving forward. And I don't think anybody sees that leadership group as a easy plug-in for a different future for Belarus. Even if Lukashenko were to disappear tomorrow, nobody is answering that question that way right now. But I think, again, the Ukrainians are thinking a lot about this Belarus question, and I think are very engaged in different discussions there that we don't have good visibility on, which is important. But I think Lukashenko for so long managed to negotiate this being independent, not getting absorbed, and then really screwed it up himself at this point. Like that's done. I think everybody understands that's done now. But I don't think anybody has really come up with a "but what's next for Belarus" answer yet. In a way that we probably need to be thinking about in a much more aggressive way before the Ukraine war ends. And I'm sorry if you can hear this terrible construction noise next door to me, but hopefully
No
not through the
problem.
microphone.
That is life.
Oh God, sorry. Yeah, the my neighbor is redoing his kitchen and they're like drilling into the wall, so it's not.
No
It's very
problem.
loud.
I mean, we got so much good insights from you. I mean, we have to hope that there are more like you in the States who think about
There are
the
some of us,
this
and
part of Europe.
we're very loud, but I think there does need to be a generational shift here, and it's not about age. It's just about like perspective and seeing. I think the reason that I have the perspective that I do is my teachers were Georgians and Estonians and Lithuanians who really took the time to sort of explain history, to explain to you what Russia is doing. The reason I understand what modern Russia is in terms of how it interacts with the world is because I spent time in the region and see what it looks like. And that I don't go to Moscow and like fall into the cafe mindset of, oh, there's this wonderful like artistic, like I don't care about that. And I think there's not enough people who view it from that perspective, which is minimizing the importance of Moscow and maximizing the importance of our actual allies who actually sacrifice with us and not to spite us. And we just need to reorient that way. It's time. Like it's time.
Okay, Molly. So it was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I'm so sorry it took so long to get it booked, but
no
I'm
problem.
happy
No,
to do it
I
again
just told my Patreons that since May 31st we were trying.
I'm sorry, I'm the worst, but
it's all
I'm
good.
happy to come back again. Just let me know.
Yeah, we'll do our
Next time
best.
I'm in Vilnius, we can actually do it in person.
Absolutely. Well,
Okay,
you know, at the latest you're gonna be here, you know, in summer.
In March.
So
Yeah.
Oh, in March even. Okay.
I'll be there in March. Yeah.
All right. So everyone, we had Molly McKew, who is a writer, a researcher, and Russian influence and information warfare expert. So thanks everyone for watching, and see you in the next Let's Talk Europe episode.